Every story has at least two sides. Reality is simply like that. From listening to one side of a story, we form our opinion, and yet no lone take on anything will encompass the whole truth of an event. I was given the task of making a video about stories of hope. However, to truly gain meaning from a story of hope, it is imperative to understand the horrors of what has made this qualify as a story of hope in the first place. My goal is that by the end of this video, you will have a greater understanding of these events than ever before. Now, let's dive deeper. Speaking of diving deeper, our first story is about a man named Rob Stewart, a man who I've looked up to for years. Rob Stewart was a Canadian filmmaker and activist who, through the medium of video, showed people the true, harmless nature of sharks and opened people's eyes to the sheer number of sharks ruthlessly slaughtered all in the name of personal monetary gain. His first movie on the subject, titled Sharkwater, performed very well and led to laws being passed all over the world to stop the needless deaths of sharks. I could stop there, and yet there's one very important detail I have thus far omitted. As you may have noticed by the fact that I introduced him as was, not is, Rob Stewart is no longer living. He drowned in a diving accident due to faulty equipment in the filming of the follow-up to Sharkwater Extinction. In spite of this, his parents and friends managed to complete the documentary, and to this day, his legacy lives on. So, not a bad story of hope, right? Of course, it in and of itself is certainly not enough to prove my point in its entirety. I, of course, need to include more stories of hope. For the next one, let's talk about something a bit more well known.
I'm here at the Oklahoma City National Museum.
A saying I like to keep in mind whenever I hear about a new technology is that before the public knew about it, it was considered for a weapon. Indeed, in our modern world, just about everything that can be weaponized currently has been weaponized. Unfortunate though it may be, these weapons can often be found in the hands of those who would misuse them. This was certainly the case in the Oklahoma City bombing, when a car bomb leveled one-third of an office building, damaged 324 other buildings to varying degrees, shattered glass in 258 buildings, destroyed 86 cars, caused $652 million in damages, injured 680 people, and killed 168. Prior to the 9/11 attacks, this had been the biggest act of terrorism in U.S. history, and still remains the largest domestic terrorist attack and second largest overall. The severity of the attack was so great that the government passed a bill that effectively cracked down on terrorism by allowing the death penalty to be issued much more easily to terrorists. Despite all this, despite the fact that hundreds died, that buildings were razed, in spite of all this, there was a tree. One tree. A tree that nobody had ever paid any mind. A tree that had been well within the blast radius. A measly little tree survived it all. This tree truly embodied the spirit of resilience. If this tree, incapable of thought, could make it through this, why not us? Who would have thought that a simple plant, a non thinking being, could be such a mighty symbol to rally behind? Nature is truly bizarre. Now, you must admit, my point is starting to make more sense, isn't it? Had you simply heard that a tree survived a bomb, you would have thought, oh, interesting, never given it a second thought. Yet, by giving you the context of the power of this bomb, the havoc it wreaked, you now see much more in the tree, to be sure, of course. In a court of law, being believable isn't enough. The truth has to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. So, here we go. You know, as much as the US is blamed for slavery, racism, and abusing third world countries, which are all things it does do, true, there is something to be said about the atrocities committed by Canada. Now, supposedly, my home country is the nice or polite country. We here are known to be kind, generous, hospitable, etc., etc. As is often the case with stereotypes, this has a basis in truth, however, it's also greatly exaggerated. Anyone who knows the story of Canada's residential schools would have a hard time calling Canada nice. For those living outside of Canada or those inside who need a reminder, residential schools were an attempt by the government and the church to wipe out Indigenous culture. Inside residential schools, children taken from their families by force are abused in multiple ways, re educated in European settler ideals, forbidden from speaking their own languages, and sometimes even killed. In 2021, starting on May 27th, multiple former residential schools were found to have contained hundreds of unmarked graves, each of Indigenous children murdered at residential schools. The cultural genocide was successful in forcing many young Indigenous people to convert to Christianity and live their lives as the white people do, in spite of their own culture. Despite all these hardships, there are many survivors, and they will never forget. We can only admire the courage of those who made it home, and hope that something like this will never happen again. Indigenous people survived school doesn't sound like a story of hope without context, now does it? However, with your newfound knowledge, it makes perfect sense. This is the power of context. But, in spite of that, there's one thing that hasn't been mentioned as of yet, something that simply cannot be ignored when it comes to stories of hope. I hope you're ready because I'm about to talk about what may very well be the most despicable event in all of history.
I'm here at this lovely sculpture at the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum.
Words often fail when trying to describe events of a certain magnitude. Yet, in spite of that, I will try my very best. Not much background is needed, as I believe that everyone watching this video has heard of possibly the worst genocide in human history, the Holocaust. Millions of Jews and, in other related events, Roma, political opponents, etc., were killed. The Jews in particular were subject to a grand total of, get ready for it, 6 million deaths. 6 million! That's absurd. It wasn't quick or easy either. These people truly suffered, watched their people die, starved, and were forced into ghettos with unspeakable living conditions. Hitler didn't invent the concept of anti Semitic genocide, nor was he the first one to commit it. He simply did what other terrible people have always done and scaled it up drastically. Indeed, the death toll and reason for death have never in the history of humanity been this ridiculous. It seems nearly impossible that anyone could survive all this, and yet here stand the Jewish people. They showed resilience in the face of adversity, and so here they are, standing strong, ensuring that the stories of the survivors are never forgotten. This is more than just surviving a war or even a genocide. Surviving the Holocaust is on a tier all its own. Wow. That's a lot of evidence. If all that can't prove my point, then I'm convinced nothing short of omniscience can. In conclusion, it is indeed true that the full context of a situation can make the hopeful pieces of it that much more impactful. And I do hope that, in the future, we can all learn from this and forge on, never forgetting the past, but always looking to the future.